The stromatolites are part biologic and part geologic, and they first appeared 3.5 billion years ago. I thought that was a great way to connect us to these timescales. But then I realized that what I'd stumbled upon as an artist was this way of thinking that was just outside of traditional scientific methodology. Because I actually have had scientists write to me and said, thank you, I'm starting to think about my research differently. I was asked to think about this talk a little bit differently than I normally do, which is to think about my practice as an artist and how I became an artist, which is a really interesting and sort of complicated question to tackle. But I actually ended up having a lot of fun, because what I started doing was looking back at some old photo albums to some early work that I did. So this is the photos that you're seeing now were taken around 1986, 87, so when I was 11 or 12 years old. I can't say it's my earliest work, but it is definitely something that had interested me as a kid. And it was really kind of fascinating to see that some of the aesthetics that in these early snapshots, which I just scanned the other day, and just wanted to show you in a very casual way what they look like. Oh, the Mitchell Corn Palace, perhaps some of you have been there. Yeah. But to see that some of that thinking that I continue as an adult through my art practice about nature and about travel, and also just thinking about framing. Like some of these ideas were really there when I was 11 years old, which is kind of fascinating to see. But I really, looking at it made me feel like these landscapes are about representations of feelings and meaning and things that I'm sure that I didn't have the language for at 11, and that continue through my work now. So, and I also, it's an interesting thing to see this connection to travel early on. I was fortunate enough to go on some great road trips as a kid. And, it made me think about the exoticism of travel and how amazing it can be. But really, I think what travel does is open your eyes, and it allows you fresh perspective. And, that's just something that I'm not sure if that's something that can be taught, but I think it's something that we can be tuned into. So I'm not going to share every little art project that I've done in the meantime, or since. I didn't bring any preschool art or anything like that. I did want to mention, though, so looking at these photos and then sort of moving on to the other next sort of significant moment in my art life was after 9/11. What you're looking at now is a separate project. This is called The Only Paradise is Paradise Lost. And I think you'll notice maybe some similarities from my early work. But going back to this road trip, so right after 9/11, I'm sure a number of you were probably here when that happened. I felt a very strong need to get out of the city. So in October, of 2001, I decided to take a road trip around the US, and I was looking for something. I was looking for a connection. I was certainly looking back towards nature, and just looking for a new perspective. And the important thing, one of the most significant things happening for me at that time was that I'd come out of art school and was quite fortunate in some ways to become a producer for web and software development, which lasted almost 10 years. And when 9/11 happened, I ended up losing my last very serious, upwardly mobile producer job. And I had this moment to stop and think about what was important to me. And it came back again to this idea of looking for meaning, and creating connection and interpretation, all of these things, again, that, even as adults, sometimes it's hard to find the language for. But I definitely realized that I was thinking about landscape in this way that was about a sort of emotional and philosophical communication. And so the Only Paradise is Paradise Lost as a project that I'd started years ago and sort of continued on over the years through doing, I mean, really up through now, I continue to work on it. And they're really landscapes about the relationship between humanity and nature. And so I'll move on to show you quite a number of the oldest living things images. But that thinking that was happening around this idea of the emotional and philosophical landscapes, that's something that was an incredibly important moment for me in terms of just focusing direction that I was going to go in. So, I had taken, I'd done an artist residency at Cooper Union in 2004, and I'd just gotten a new camera. It was this Mamiya 7.2 medium format film camera, which I still have and have since taken all over the world. And I set out. I set out from this residency thinking, I really need some big project to sink my teeth into, and not just a project, but something that would feel substantive and that could combine all of these things that I've been interested in for so many years. So some of that has to do with the nature, that is obviously nature and landscape has been something that since I was a kid was important. There's also the travel aspects. And more importantly, though, is that sort of philosophical thinking. And eventually it came to be clear to me that that thinking was primarily focused around this idea of connecting with deep time and creating perspective around deep time. Sorry. That's an elephant seal at Ernest Shackleton's grave. Anyway, so after that residency at Cooper Union, I had gotten an invitation to go to Japan, and I pretty much never turned down an invitation to travel. I mean, maybe a little bit more now than I used to, because I get a little tired. But I went to Japan without an agenda, really, other than to continue that landscape work, so making these photos about the relationship between humanity and nature, and looking for some sort of adventure. I had a couple of different ideas of things that I might want to do, places I might want to go. But I was really unsure. I mean, I just had this feeling I was looking for something, but I didn't know what it was yet. And I had a great time in Tokyo with my friends, and then I was going off on my own to travel through different parts of Japan. And I went to one of my first stops was in Kyoto. And I got there, and you have these ideas, and when you're traveling, ideas about what a place is going to be like. And you think of the old temples and all this history. And I pulled into the train station, and there's Starbucks and Kinko's. And you're thinking, this isn't quite what I thought it was going to be. And I felt a little uncomfortable there. It just didn't have the resonance I was looking for. And I thought about going home, which is something that I never do. It's very uncharacteristic of me. And I thought, I could just call it a day, but then something gave me pause, and that was a couple of different people had mentioned, oh, you're interested in nature, you have to go visit the 7,000-year-old tree. I'm like, okay, that sounds pretty interesting. And this tree, it's named Jōmon Sugi. It's in the gallery in the other room, so we can go see it. It lives on this remote island. You have to go to the southernmost part of Kyushu and then get this 3 or 4 hour ferry ride over to the island. Then when you get to the island, it's a 2-day hike to get to the tree. So, this was a pretty big decision. But I decided to do it. I gave myself permission to go home, and then I turned around and packed up and went the other direction. And I decided that that there was something far more interesting in taking the chance and having the experience. And through that, I felt like I couldn't have possibly been more richly rewarded. So, on the ferry ride on the way over, I got befriended by this couple who were, eyeing my rolling suitcase when I told them I was doing this hike to the tree. They're like, you might not be prepared. But by the time I reached the other shore, I was invited to stay with them at this Japanese family's home for a week. And then it turned out that one of them had done the English translation for the Japanese sign for the tree. So I couldn't have found a better people to run into and befriend. And I ended up having this just truly magical and transformative experience. But I think, with creative work, regardless of whether it's art or not, we all want to have this sort of lightning bolt of inspiration. And I would love to tell you that, like, oh, standing in front of the tree and got this idea, but that's not how it happened. So, this experience was obviously layered and nuanced and incredibly important to me, but I think of that whole period as a time of creative churn. So meaning that I was following all these ideas and threads of things that didn't seem like they were related necessarily, but they all seemed worth following. So it was over a year later, I was having some Thai food in Soho, and I believe my friend Josh was there, or we were going to see your play. Anyway, there's some connection here, which is still going, which is amazing. And I was sharing the story of this trip, and all of a sudden, that was my light bulb moment. But that wouldn't have been possible with, I would say, without a year, maybe even more time before that, where all of these ideas were just sort of percolating and waiting to come together and just sort of fuse into a more crystallized and cohesive interconnection. And and as soon as they did, it made perfect sense. I could combine the art, science, philosophical thinking, and environmentalism in this seamless way. And this was all connected through this idea of looking at deep time. And so deep time is not a technical term. It's really meant to just help you create a more personal relationship to timescales that are outside of our human physiological experience of time. So different from a geologic epoch or era or a cosmic epoch. So I had this idea that I would look at year zero and back. So 2,000 years old and older is very simple. The reason being, I wanted to just call into question, why is it, it was 2004, 2005 at the time, why is it 2015 right now? What does that mean? And so to be able to look at these organisms that have been alive and continuously living for 2,000 years or more, I thought that's a great way to anthropomorphize them, to think about them as these living individuals and connect us to these timescales that we just otherwise really can't process and internalize in a meaningful way. So that was one important aspect of the work. I was really thinking of the whole body of work as a conceptual art project, but it's transdisciplinary. So the science was just as important as anything else. It was important that it be real science, that I was working with scientists. So I initially thought that I would find a scientist to collaborate with me and be my partner through the whole project. And what I found was that they all said that they weren't qualified. And that was a little baffling to me. But then I realized that what I'd stumbled upon as an artist was this way of thinking that was just outside of traditional scientific methodology. So, I have subjects that are plants, I have subjects that are animals, I have subjects that are bacteria. So this is 5 different areas of the sciences right off the bat. It's not one single cohesive study. There just isn't an area of the sciences that deals with longevity across species. So it was fascinating to me that as an artist, I was the one who could say, well, wait a second, why don't we look at this from this different perspective? And so what I found was, instead of working with one scientist, I worked with 30. So I found the research, I would find the scientific research papers, find the researchers, and contact them, and oftentimes they were thrilled to have me come join them in the field, or they'd give me instructions on how to find these organisms. And it ended up being an incredibly rich and interesting experience for me. But one of the things it really underscored was both the value of being an artist and the importance of doing transdisciplinary work. This isn't something that, I was thinking about this and thinking about the nature of what it is to be an artist. And I think at the heart of it is the freedom to be able to pursue interests that you feel are compelling and that are not necessarily things that are traditional in the sense of, you might not have the support that you would get if you're a scientist. One of the things that I was thinking about recently is that how there's very few scientists that work independently. If you're doing a scientific research project, you probably are in an academic institution, you're getting funding, and then you start the research. With artists, it's often the opposite of that. I know very few fully supported artists and very few artists that have even some funding for their work, and they do it anyway. So I don't know if that is what defines an artist necessarily, but it's certainly a very important factor. And one of the questions I do get asked a lot is, how did I fund the oldest living things? And in part, as you all know, I did a Kickstarter campaign back in 2010, which was very early days, and was really a wonderful experience in building community around my work. But I did a whole slew of other things and continue to do a whole slew of other things. So one of the things that I think is really an important part of being an artist and an artist living in New York City is trying to demystify the experience a bit. So I just wanted to share, I did fundraisers, I accepted help money, money from family, I borrowed money from friends, but I also did things like I bartered for tropical medicine immunizations and dentistry. I bartered artwork. And I've sold artwork too. Of course, this is a wonderful thing when you're able to create art objects. So, even though Oldest Living Things is very much a conceptual project, I'm still making art objects, and you'll see some of them in the gallery afterwards. And then I do a lot of writing. I sometimes sell photographs for use in magazines and public speaking engagements. But I think the key thing is to mix it up, because it's really, I think there's quite a mythology that can get built up about being the artist that makes it and breaks through. And, more times than not, it's really going to be yourself pulling yourself up from with your bootstraps. But certainly Kickstarter and creating community is an important part, and something that I certainly hope to do again. So now that I've gone back, I'm going to try to skip forward. Please bear with me. Okay, good. So over the past year, as the Oldest Living Things was sort of winding down, I started winding up a new project. So I've started thinking about ideas surrounding deep time and deep space. So the theme of deep time that came out of the Oldest Living Things was something that not only really resonated with me, but also just felt like almost impossible to fully take in. And a couple of my subjects were dealing with not only these 2 or 10 or 100,000 year timescales, but things like the stromatolites are tied to 3.5 billion years ago, and this started getting me thinking about time on a much deeper time scale. So I've been quite fortunate to be part of the LACMA Art and Technology Lab this past year, and it's one of the few places that allows you to incubate ideas, very much like what I was describing to you, my experience about getting the idea for the Oldest Living Things. So, being in this place where, I have these compelling threads that I'm following, but I'm not entirely sure how they're going to connect. So this year I've been spending some time, I'm still continuing to speak with scientists, but now particle physicists and cosmologists, at places like NASA JPL and NASA Ames and CERN. And I have a few ideas that I've been working on, but I haven't had my aha light bulb moment yet. So I'm actually going out to Ames in a week or so, and I want to just keep exploring. And that's something that I hope that as a culture we can support more and more just for our artistic community, because there's nothing like the opportunity to do some blue sky art. So thank you very much. I would love to answer your questions. And,
Yeah, as you
Oh, sorry, there's a mic coming to you.
Hi. As you had more and more conversations with scientists, did you find that you were able to speak to them more about kind of what you had learned from other scientists, and did it move from being just kind of an interview to being more of a dialogue about I guess the differences between animals and plants and bacteria?
It's a really good question. Yeah. So, I think in general, absolutely. So I found it really quite wonderful when I was able to talk to, for instance, a botanist in South Africa studying a particular type of desert plant who wasn't familiar with the research being done on what I saw as to be a similar kind of organism living in the Mojave. And I said, hey, you guys should talk. And sometimes that would actually happen and be a fruitful conversation. So I think that there's a couple of ways to look at it. For me, it was important that I wasn't just using the science in a superficial way. But I think, this is something that art and science projects you just have to be wary of. So you don't want to just make the science look pretty or just get enamored with the scientific tools and just make something that really isn't extending either. So in some cases, I actually have had scientists write to me and said, thank you, I'm starting to think about my research differently. And to me, that's a win. Like, that's exactly what I would want to have happen. And even though I've done as much homework as I can about each of these organisms, I'm not expecting to make a scientific breakthrough, but I hope that the result is something that's expansive, that's something that the scientists and people in really in any discipline can relate to and grow new work from. Yeah. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Did I see this show at what's it somewhere in Dumbo, or not at Dumbo?
Pioneer Works.
Pioneer Works.
I don't know. Did you?
Yeah, I did. So do you just go? Are you going to be? Are you on tour, kind of, sort of?
Yeah.
Kind of
So the work that I have here in the gallery at Kickstarter is a very small sample. We actually raided my studio and put together a few new vinyl pieces here. But the large solo exhibition is traveling right now. So it was in Pioneer Works. It was just closed at Bucknell University, and it's now moving to the National Museum of Wildlife Art, which is in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So if you're out west this summer, please do visit. Yeah.
Back to the concept of you were talking about deep time. If you could observe the scope of the planet in a macro scale, what do you think would be the most important observation for you? Like, what would you really feel connected to? Like, whether it be plant or just the landscape itself?
You'd like a specific example of?
No, I mean, like, what do you think would be the most important observation to make if you could watch the entire lifespan of the Earth? And
I would ask you. It sounds like you might have an idea about what's most important to you, but I'll answer the question only insofar as I started to hint at one of the things that was really important and inspirational for me, and that was the stromatolites. So the stromatolites are part biologic and part geologic, and they're certainly one of the first living organisms on Earth, if not the first. They first appeared 3.5 billion years ago. And to me, just hearing that number really stretched my thinking. But more importantly than that, they perform photosynthesis. So it's the bacteria, the living part of it, perform photosynthesis. And they oxygenated our atmosphere. And it took 900 million years. And so to me, thinking about timescales like that really just changed my perspective. And I want to be able to hold on and relate to it. And the fact that it's connected to all life that exists on Earth since then, just is something that I find both just elemental and really compelling, and something I want to know more about.
It occurred to me, I wondered what your thoughts were in terms of seeing these oldest living things and climate change, and were you thinking about all of that, and what were some thoughts that you had about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Climate change is I'd say, integral part of what the work is about, but not in a way where it's going to hit you over the head with it. I've considered myself an environmentalist or just my entire life. Like, this is something that I've understood, this relationship with the planet, to be incredibly important and also tenuous. And so one of the things that I wanted to do in looking at these organisms with the extreme longevity is to point out, in some ways, they are anomalous in that they've survived this incredible length of time, but they're all under threat in different ways by different aspects of climate change, and some in much more pronounced ways than others. So the spruce tree, for instance, that's on the cover of the book, to me, that is a portrait of climate change. So there's this sort of scrubby mass of branches at the bottom that's near the soil line that was growing that way for 9,500 years. And then 50 years ago, the spindly trunk started growing in the center because the climate zone got warmer at the top of this plateau where it lives in Sweden. And so this is in this remote place. There's not many people coming by. It's not like, oh, somebody carved their initials in it. This is something that is a global issue in this what seemingly otherwise untouched place that's being affected by climate change. So my hope is that by looking at these organisms, that they'll do two things, not just looking at them, but relating to them. So in some ways, they can illustrate some of the effects of climate change that are happening right now, but also to serve as something that's both hopeful and a way to connect us in a more positive way about conserving and preserving them as much as possible. And in doing that, we would have to be more conservation-minded about the entire ecosystems around them.
Hi, can you speak to how your research has informed the way you photographed your subjects? Has that, when you started contacting the scientists, did that change the way you took your photographs?
So how the choices that I would make in making the photographs, if that's affected by the research? Well, you could see, it's interesting. I don't often show multiple bodies of work at the same time. So you saw some of my landscape work. It looks fairly different from the photographs of the oldest living things, although there are some landscapes in that project, in that body of work as well. So it sort of connects to this idea of the individualism that I was talking about in regard to climate change, but also in regard to deep time. I was thinking of the subjects more as, in thinking of them as individuals, thinking of the photographs more as making portraits as opposed to making landscapes. So the sort of emotional, conceptual landscapes just have a separate feel and a separate aesthetic, and my concerns about that work were quite different from those images than compared to the oldest living things images. So I wouldn't say that the research per se was a deciding factor in how I made those photos, but it was important to me that they seem real in a way. So I wasn't waiting, I didn't wait for a week for a perfect beam of light to hit the leaves in some, grand way. That it was more important to me to make images that felt very much as these organisms are where they live.
Have you ever had a moment where you felt like your medium or your craft and your skill in the craft was insufficient to capture the subject that you were trying to capture, and what did you do?
That's a great question. I mean, I think anybody in a creative pursuit probably feels some doubt about what they're doing, regardless of what it is. And especially with a project this big, that's something that I certainly had worry from time to time that, how was I going to do justice to this idea? And, the more, over the years, I thought more and more about the work. You get to know you get to know your own work and your own practice more and more. And it became clear to me that it was a conceptual project more than it was a photography project. The photos are obviously vital, and I couldn't make this project without them. If I'd made illustrations, that would be something quite different than the photographs. So I think it's a combination of things. I mean, it's work, I would say, just in general terms, working through fear and doubt and not giving up is more important than, what camera you have or should you switch mediums. To me, it's always about the idea. And you know, as I'm starting this new work with the deep time and deep space, I know I've showed you some photos, but those are just snapshots of thinking, in a sense. To me, those are sketches. You know, I'm very likely going to make some light installations or some site-specific large-scale installations that I have in mind that I may, you know, we'll see what happens with them. But I think it's, you know, this is one of those things where, as an artist, maybe more so than in other areas, you don't have somebody to really tell you you're doing it right. You know, you can tell, somebody can tell you your technique is good, or even that's a good idea, but it's really up to you.
Quick one over here. The time, the ages that you put on the photos, I assume some of them are based on, we know the actual age of this specimen to some degree, and sometimes it's based on an estimate of how long we know this species lives for. Just a little bit about the times, the ages that
Yes.
you put on the individual photos.
Yeah, so you notice that some of the ages have ranges. A number of them have even number, or you know, exactly 10,000 years. Well, that's really what it's indicating, is that we have a general idea of how old something is, or there's a couple of different parameters that in the scientific research that would have, depending on how those play out, would affect the age. So when you're looking at these clonal organisms, so I didn't go too much into the hard science with the difference between a unitary organism and a clonal organism. So a unitary organism is most of the trees you would see, for instance, are unitary. So the oldest unitary organisms are the bristlecone pines, which are just over 5,000 years old. But some of the things in the project are tens and hundreds of thousands of years old. And what that means is they're self-propagating. So there's no new genetic information being introduced. And to me, that was important from a philosophical level perspective, but it really is scientifically accurate as well. You just wouldn't normally group them together. And to give an example of how you might date a clonal organism, it's a multi-step process that depends on what kind of living being it is. But for instance, the Tasmanian lomatia, it's 43,600 years old. It's this big number, it's very specific, it's fairly specific. And the reason we know that is that they found a fossil in the area that was radiocarbon dated to the 43,600 years. And then they did a genetic test of both the fossilized sample and the living lomatia and found it was a perfect genetic match. But what that means is they know it's at least 43,600 years old. You know, so there's a lot of chance in science that we don't really think about on a day-to-day basis. You know, somebody could have found an 80,000-year-old fossil or a 43,700-year-old fossil. So there's a lot of, I would say, they're not guesses, but they're educated estimates a lot of times. Yeah.
So I'm really curious to know how you made the transition from being a commercial producer to a full-time fine artist.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I didn't really I skipped over some important parts of my background. I did go to art school, so not that I think that's required to be an artist by any means, and in some ways I think it maybe is a bit of a setback if you're thinking about going to art school. So I studied photography as an undergrad, and in some ways was just very fortunate to stumble into a career as an internet producer at a time when it was, you know, the boom was just starting, and you know, I hadn't ever planned to be a commercial photographer. So I always intended to make art, not to do commercial work. And so in some ways it was just a lucky confluence that I was able to take some of the skills that I'd learned in undergrad and take them into this position. And it was quite interesting. And in some ways, I think that work was some of the best training that I ever had to be able to execute a big project like The Oldest Living Things. I learned to manage schedules and budgets and talk to people across disciplines, because as a producer, you're working with designers, you're working with technologists, you have to understand the technology, you're working with clients who have an additional set of concerns. So I think I kept learning through that process, and it was incredibly important until the point where I realized the work behind it was not something that was important or compelling to me. It just didn't have enough meaning. So as I was saying a little bit with the 9/11 road trip story, I had this moment where I realized I'd had enough of that experience, that I learned what I was going to learn, and I really wanted to rededicate or really dedicate myself to art in that moment. So this was this month-long trip, ended up being this way that my thinking just became transformed. And I never went back to a full-time upwardly mobile position after that. I realized that my energy should be placed elsewhere. Okay, 2 more questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi. I saw. Oh, there we go. I saw your work also in at Pioneer Works, and I know Dustin has been integrating a lot more science into his art program, and he does residencies. And I was wondering if Pioneer Works was at all involved in like funding or developing your project, and like how it became part of the tour of the exhibition, and how, I guess, how you found venues for the tour of the exhibition.
The short answer is no, they weren't really directly involved in the project, and certainly in developing the project. And the curator for the exhibition was the photo editor for my book. And I actually first found out about Pioneer Works from one of the scientists who is on the board and works there, and then had some other connections through some producers there as well. So it did, as you're saying, because the program there does include a lot of art and science. It seemed like a good fit, but a lot of it was on my own. So I did have some support. So I had Shutterstock through was Offset Images, ended up being the one sponsor for the show. They sponsored us a part of it, and quite frankly, the rest of the money came from the Guggenheim grant that I received this year. So I chose to follow through with making the exhibition and paying for, as I'm sure you know, making prints and framing them are it's incredibly expensive, and it's an investment that you end up having to make in yourself over and over and over again. So Pioneer Works was, I think, a really good fit in order to show the work in the way that I did, and you'll see some of the elements of it here at Kickstarter, where I have the vinyl infographic, so the taxonomy. That was up at Pioneer Works as well, and these are elements that I created in the book, so working with an illustrator and an evolutionary biologist together. But these are things that were developed separately, and I wish I could tell you some magic answer on how to get an exhibition to travel, but I'm still working on that myself, so I don't know where it goes after the next stop. And I'd say tenacity is the best advice I can give you. So I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm just curious, as an artist, and I happen to know you, so I know how many years you've been working on this pursuit, on this project, and it finally culminated in this beautiful book, and you had the exhibition, and the book got a lot of recognition, and that must be so rewarding, and the Guggenheim grant, but thinking about you had the experience which was not being an artist, but working in the tech industry, and you learned everything you needed to learn from that, and then you realized it was time to move on to your dream of pursuing a photography project, and then you found it. And now that you're kind of moving on to now I feel like that sort of led you into your next project, and even though you're still feeling your way, do you feel as an artist that you can kind of put your first baby to bed? Do you feel like that it's finally realized and you've learned what you needed to learn from it and been able to express all of these complex ideas for the world, and now you can just move on? Or is there more, if someone came saying they wanted to make a documentary and they want you to travel all around the world with the previous body of work, are you ready to move on?
I definitely need a vacation first, but no, it's a really good.
Can a project keep living and evolving, or is it important for you to move on?
Yeah, I think that's a really good and important question, and it's There's a few answers to it. I mean, in some ways, yes. Like I feel like being able to, I mean, for one thing, just creatively shifting gears from, oh, I'm going here, I'm going there, I'm doing more research, like being in process to then, creating the book in particular was this time where I had to say, okay, well now I have to synthesize all of this and say what I mean and select, winnow down thousands of images to 125. And this is an incredibly different and difficult and great process. And then to be able to exhibit the work now. But I feel like, I talk about it as being phase 1, like 10 years was phase 1. Phase 2, I don't know. I feel like I know enough to say that I can't tell you for sure definitively. I wouldn't say that it's done. I can't say what's going to happen next because I'm not sure. I mean, in terms of the science and the organisms, like I have, even in the book, I mentioned several places that I'd like to go that I wasn't able to get to where I know there are things that would qualify. But, I also feel like it might be important to think about connecting to connecting with people in a different way through the work. Maybe there's some way that I'm not the one who travels around and does it, or maybe a film is the right thing. So I don't really believe in shutting any doors on it. But I also know that creatively it feels so important to me to do something new that is, this is why the exploration of deep time and deep space feels right to me. So it's the thing that still is like, wow, that, really, I find it fascinating and incredibly hard to wrap my head around in the way that, and also just feel the same way that I did back when I was sorting through, like, oh, I have all these different ideas and I don't know how they connect together, but I sort of trust that they will. And that's how I feel about the new work right now. So, yeah. Thank you, everybody.